I mentioned that we would touch on CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. The aim of this directive is to foster sustainable and responsible corporate behavior and to anchor human rights and environmental consideration in companies' operations and corporate governance. The new rules are going to ensure that businesses' their actions or make sure that there are no adverse impacts from their actions. And those actions include things like in their value chains inside and outside of Europe. The emphasis is on human rights, and it can mean a few things, including a ban on procuring raw materials from suppliers in locations with human rights abuses, or it can mean companies such as textile retailers will have to identify, assess, prevent, mitigate, and bring to an end and remedy their negative impact and that of their upstream and downstream partners, including the production, supply, transport, and storage, design, and distribution on people as well as the planet. So limit negative impacts to people and the planet. In order to do that, companies will be required to make investments, to seek contractual assurances from their partners or suppliers, to improve their business plan or provide support to their partners or suppliers that are medium or small size enterprises. So what does that mean? That means that people like H&M will have to make sure that their suppliers, i.e. RMG guys, are not having any negative impact on the things that I mentioned, i.e. There are no human rights violations, that cotton or raw materials are not sourced from areas where there are human rights violations, that there have been no negative impact to social elements along the value chain of the product that the retailer is selling in the EU. Now, I would be remiss if I weren't to bring up this important topic, which I have spoken about many, many times over the past few years, which has become more and more prevalent around the world, really, and that's what we call TCFD. TCFD is a Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and we won't go into all the details here, but there are some important elements worth repeating as they actually tie in and relate very well to these EU regulations. This regulation, or this actually it's not a regulation, it's recommendations for accounting that has become mandatory in some jurisdictions. I'll show you a list of those jurisdictions shortly, and it dictates what sort of disclosures companies must make or should make. And the most important disclosure that we're concerned about now is what we call emissions data. So those are the emissions that the company is responsible for and their supply chain is responsible for. Now, just to recap, I have a feeling this is familiar to most people here, but just to recap, there are three broad types of emissions in question that TCFD recommends reporting companies, so those are people that use accounting practices, which is effectively any company in the world, should be reporting on. And those are Scope 1. Scope 1 emissions are emissions that are a result of the company's own operation. Manufactured things, I need to be able to track the amount of emissions my own company or my own factory is responsible for, and I need to be able to report that so that stakeholders are able to make a decision about whether or not they want to do business with me as a Scope 1 emitter. The second scope is Scope 2 emissions. Scope 2 emissions are emissions that are a result of purchasing electricity or other forms of energy. So if you think about it, when electricity or energy is produced, there's a few different ways you can make electricity, right? You can use coal, you can use natural gas, or you can use wind, or you can use solar. Depending on how the electricity that my company uses is produced, there may be emissions associated, greenhouse gas emissions associated with producing that electricity. And finally, the big one, the complicated one that gives everybody heartache and is difficult to implement is Scope 3. Scope 3 emissions are a result of a company's value chain. What is a value chain? Well, a value chain is a supply chain. It can be upstream or it could be downstream. In other words, this reporting, Scope 3 reporting, requires that companies disclose the level of emissions their supply chain or procurement is responsible for. So if I am a European garment retailer, then I will need to disclose the level of emissions that my suppliers, so in some cases that's RMG manufacturers in Bangladesh, are responsible for. Now, there's all sorts of fine print details around this to make sure that there's no double counting or double reporting of emissions, but big picture, that's the thing. So you can understand now that if EU is implementing these regulations under the Green Deal, and at the same time there are requirements to report on emissions, they kind of tie together and go hand in hand, right? So one will reinforce the other. As I mentioned, I'm now showing you some jurisdictions in Asia where ESG reporting, whether it's TCFD or some other form of reporting, have become mandatory. So usually when it becomes mandatory, it's a central bank imposing on member banks in the country, or the regulatory body that oversees the stock exchange mandating that public companies report or adopt the reporting practices. But in Singapore, actually now it's recently announced that even non-listed companies will have to report on sustainability issues, including TCFD. So these on the screen, you can see that New Zealand, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Japan, and Thailand all have already, to some extent, implemented or announced that sustainability reporting, including TCFD, will become mandatory. Now, if that's the case in all of these countries, understandably, it's going to spread even wider.